Gregor Mendel was a monk who lived a while back in the 1800s, and he is called the father of genetics because he was the first person to really study genetics. And he studied genetics through pea plants, and so he would cross different pea plants by cross-pollination and see what kind of traits their offspring had. And he noticed that the traits from the parents often got passed on to the offspring. And so he was the first one to recognize this as the mechanism of inheritance. And when he was studying pea plants, he didn't use the word genes to describe what got passed on from parent to offspring. Instead, he used the word factors, and he said that factors got passed on. But now we call those factors that he was talking about genes. And he also noticed that those factors or genes occur in pairs, and so one parent passes on one gene to their offspring, and the offspring ends up with a pair of genes for each trait. Mendel left us with what he calls his law of segregation, and it says 4 things. First, it says that for every trait, every thing that you have that gets passed on from your parents, an organism carries 2 genes. And each of those genes is on a homologous chromosome. So homologous chromosomes are chromosomes that are the same length, same shape. And so on each of the 2 chromosomes that are the same length and same shape, you have a gene. And those 2 genes together tell you what kind of trait you have. Each of the parents give 1 gene to the offspring organism, and that's why they end up with 2. And each gene individually is called an allele. And an allele is just every different version of a gene. So there are alleles for blonde hair, and alleles for brown hair, and alleles for blue eyes, and alleles for green eyes. And each one of those individual types of genes is called an allele. Genes or alleles can also be recessive or dominant. So we'll see that depending on what kind of trait gets passed on, they'll be expressed as either recessive or dominant. Alright, so recessive alleles are going to be represented by lowercase letters, and dominant alleles are represented by capital letters. So anytime we're trying to describe a trait, we're going to choose a letter. For example, if we were describing either short or tall plants, we might use a T for tall. And so a capital T would represent the dominant allele for tallness, which is a tall plant, and a lowercase t would represent the recessive allele for tallness, which is a short plant. So if when 2 plants produce an offspring, one of them contributes a capital T and the other contributes a capital T, you would end up with a tall plant because you have 2 genes for tallness. If one of the parents contributes a capital T and the other a lowercase t, you have 1 gene for tallness and 1 gene for shortness. Because tallness is dominant, it's going to take over, and so that's still going to look like a tall plant. If one of the parents contributes a little t and the other one also contributes a little t, then that would be a short plant because you have 2 genes for shortness. So if a dominant allele is present, in this example, if there's a capital T present, then the dominant trait will be expressed, which was tallness. If only recessive alleles are present, like in the little t example, then the recessive trait will be expressed, which in this example was shortness. When we talk about pairs of genes, we can call them either homozygous or heterozygous. If a pair of genes is homozygous, that means it has 2 of the same kind of letters, either 2 capital letters, 2 dominant genes, or 2 recessive genes, or lowercase letters. If they're the same kind of letter, then we call them homozygous. Purebred is another word for homozygous. It means the same thing. And the other kind of pair that we can have is heterozygous, and that's when you have a capital paired with a lowercase, or 2 different kinds of letters. So heterozygous is when you have 1 dominant gene paired with a recessive gene. And hybrid is another word for heterozygous. They mean the same thing. Alright, genotype is a word that we use to describe the genes that an individual has. So if I asked for genotype for plant size, then we would say either capital T, capital T lowercase t or lowercase t, because we're going to actually describe the tallness gene as either a gene that's dominant for tallness or a gene that's recessive for tallness, or a short gene. So that genotype is actually the combination of letters. Phenotype is a description of the trait, and you can remember the difference between genotype and phenotype because phenotype starts with ph, like the word physical. So phenotype is the physical appearance. So in tallness, our phenotype would either be a tall plant or a short plant. And so it's actually talking about what it looks like, not necessarily what genes it has, because remember that there are two combinations of genes that would give you a tall plant. There's capital T and capital T lowercase t. When you're talking about genotype, you have to distinguish between those two. When you're talking about phenotype, you can just call it a tall plant, and we don't know what kind of genes it has, just that it's tall. Or a short plant, just based on the fact that it looks short. So phenotype is the physical appearance, and genotype is the actual genes that the organism has. Punnett squares are a tool that we use to predict what kind of offspring two individuals can have. And it's important that you notice that it's only a prediction. It doesn't necessarily mean that they will have that number of offspring, just that it tells us the likelihood that they'll have a certain kind of offspring. There are two kinds of Punnett squares. There are monohybrid Punnett squares, which have 4 squares and are the simpler of the two, and dihybrid Punnett squares, which actually have 16 squares and are a little more complicated. When you're solving a genetics problem, the first thing that you need to do is to choose a letter to represent the genes. And so it's often useful to write down the 2 genes we're talking about, and then to choose a letter to represent them, and write the letter next to the type of gene. So if we were doing a problem about tall and short plants, we might write tall as the first trait, dash capital T, because we would choose a capital T to represent it, and then short with a little t next to it, because we would use a little t to represent that. And usually the letter that we choose comes from the first letter of the dominant trait. And remember that dominant traits have to be a capital letter, and recessive traits have to be a lowercase letter. After you've chosen a letter, then you're going to write the genotypes of the parents. And so you figure out what the mom and the dad are, whether they are homozygous, heterozygous, dominant, or recessive. And you write their genotypes, which means you write down the letters that describe their traits, the genes. The third thing you have to do is determine the possible gametes, and that means that you're going to split up the genotypes of the parents. So it's a pair of letters when you write it as a genotype, and you're going to split the genotype up into individual letters. And then you write those letters across the top and the side of the Punnett square, with the mom's gametes across the top and the dad's gametes across the side. So you have individual letters now instead of pairs, and they're written across the top and side of the Punnett square. And then you are going to take the letter from the side and combine it with the letter from the top for each square. So you're combining gametes to make actual possible offspring. And then once the Punnett square is completely filled out, then you can figure out the phenotypes of the offspring. So we could figure out, if we crossed 2 plants, whether the offspring would be tall or short. So phenotype, remember, is the physical description. When you're writing genotype and phenotype ratios, which is something you might be asked to do in one of these problems, the ratio is just the numbers of possible outcomes that reflect either a particular genotype or a particular phenotype.